My name is Dr. Bill Miller, and we're going to talk today about the origins of life. I had been a physician by training and practiced in academic medicine and in private practice for many decades. Became deeply interested in evolution, which led to my book, The Microcosm Within: Evolution and Extinction in the Hologenome. All of you are undoubtedly familiar with the contentious arguments about Darwinism versus creationism and evolution. This debate has been present within our larger society and even within academia and outside of it. And this difference of opinion spills over into the concepts of the origin of life, too. The perspective that I'll offer in our discussion about the origin of life on this planet is that it can be considered the result of natural physical processes. No supernatural agency needs to be implicated. Certainly. That can remain true even if we do not fully apprehend exactly how life occurred on this planet. This doesn't completely discount the possibility of an intelligent creative entity of one form or another, but our approach to the topic will be from the perspective, and some might say from the bias, that there are intrinsic organic processes that can be actualized on the planet and can propel life on Earth with all its variety of forms and its abundances. That is, if only we can discern those forces. Having said that, the mystery of it all can by no means be entirely discounted. And there can be no doubt that the exact origins of life have been a mystery for a very long time. For example, here's what Paul Davies, a brilliant physicist who's championed concepts of self organization, has to say about it. Many investigators feel uneasy stating in public that the origin of life is a mystery, even though behind closed doors they admit that they're baffled. Beyond leaving physicists stumped, biologists have an equal sense of wonderment about life and its probabilities. Francis Crick of Watson and Crick and the DNA helix says this: an honest man, armed with all the knowledge available to us now, could only state that in some sense, the origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a miracle. So many are the conditions which would have had to have been satisfied to get it going. Now, we may not be at a point in which we can definitively defend an answer to the question of those exact elements that separate life from non life, but that doesn't mean we haven't made progress towards reaching an answer. One advantage is that we now have better answers to one part of the puzzle. The question has been this: how is complex life on this planet actually constructed? What we now know is that macroorganisms have to be appraised in a fundamentally different manner than we had before. And by doing that, we're learning that we need to concentrate on their cellular properties as opposed to their macroorganic appearances. We're seduced by the variety and wonder and the apparent complexity of life. However, by reappraising life as it evolves, improved answers can be offered to its origin too. The key is to fully and completely appreciate the cellular nature of life on Earth and its eternal partnership with the microbial realm. Lewis Thomas was a great scientist and essayist. And like myself, he trained as a physician. Here's a perspective that I'll quote from his admirable Lives of a Cell. The uniformity of Earth's life, more astounding than its diversity, is accountable by the high probability that we derived originally from a single cell, fertilized in a bolt of lightning as the Earth cooled. It is from the progeny of this parent cell that we take our looks. We still share genes around, and the resemblance of the enzymes of grasses to those of whales is a family resemblance. Now, whether or not we're formed by a bolt of lightning is not the point. What is relevant is his observation of our unicellular origins, and that despite the impressive variety of our external phenotypic appearances, and even the vast majority of the metabolic systems, we're all descended from the unicell and continue to resemble it in remarkable ways. It's this connection that can afford some insight into the origin of life on Earth. So buckle up, we're going to move briskly. There's a lot to cover. One of the great questions has been whether life is best viewed as a lightning bolt strike, a sudden instantiation, or alternatively, was life achieved through a series of linked plateaus? If it was the latter, then perhaps it was a step by step process, and that could eventually be testable. Let's start our investigation with what great thinkers of the past were considering. Obviously, ancient cultures gave this a great deal of thought. The initial debate centered around the concept of abiogenesis. That's the concept that life comes from non life, and that the alternative is biopoiesis. That is, that the origin of life can only be from life. So, a great question was framed around the consideration of whether life comes only from life, or could a natural process permit life to arise from non living matter? Now, the concept seems weird, and we might wonder how could great minds have possibly believed that life could come from non life? But keep this in mind to the unaided eye, without the benefit of microscopy, maggots really do seem to spontaneously appear on meat. So much thought was given to the general concept of spontaneous generation of life from non living matter. And this seemed completely credible to Aristotle and the Greek philosophers. After all, their direct observations supported it. It was firmly believed that life sprang from non living decaying substances or from rotting matter. So, for example, Aristotle believed that flies could be seen to come from putrid matter, and frogs comes from slime, or crocodiles came from rotting logs at the bottom of bodies of water. How then could they account for the great variety of life that they were observing? Well, of course, they had an answer: heterogenesis. One form of life derives from a different form. So, for example, bees would come from flowers. This belief system was so strongly held that it was a dominant one for over 1,500 years. By the 17th century, this unquestioning belief was beginning to be actively debated. In 1646, Sir Thomas Browne, he was a brilliant English polymath, attacked the premise, though. But the belief was so deeply ingrained that his contemporary, Alexander Ross, refuted him by saying this, and to quote: to question spontaneous generation is to question reason, sense, and experience. However, by 1665, the great scientist Robert Hooke did something very important. He made drawings of the first microorganisms, and then Anton von Leeuwenhoek described bacteria and protozoa. Now, Leeuwenhoek felt that spontaneous generation was an inadequate explanation for what he could observe, and the first experimental evidence was finally offered by Francisco Redi in 1668, who demonstrated that no maggots appeared on meat when flies were prevented from laying eggs. Instead, a new and exciting set of beliefs began to arise. This new theory was biogenesis. Every living thing comes from a pre existing living thing. This term has been credited variously to Henry Bastain. He was an English physiologist, and he believed that he could observe spontaneous generation of living organisms from other living organisms under the microscope. The observations of Pasteur and his experiments effectively ended the concept of spontaneous generation. He believed that his germ theory could never gain full acceptance if spontaneous generation was continued to be believed. So he conducted a simple experiment. He put beef broth in a long necked flask and he boiled it to sterilize it. And he showed that he never permitted the residue to be exposed to air. It remained sterile, it had no life. However, if exposed to air, it would become cloudy, and that indicated bacterial contamination. One reaction to this belief was panspermia, but that posed a new problem. How might the original life arise if life did indeed only come from other life? The answer would have to have been that it originated from somewhere else in the universe. Even Darwin addressed this problem, but his answer was different. He wrote a letter to Joseph Dalton Hooker in 1871, and he made the famous suggestion that life may have been, and this is to quote, from a warm little pond with all sorts of ammonia and phosphoric salts, light, heat, electricity, etc., present, so that a protein compound was chemically formed, ready to undergo still more complex changes. This Darwinistic view continued for some time, actually, until 1924, when Alexander Oparin, he was a Soviet biochemist, noted that atmospheric oxygen prevents the synthesis of certain organic compounds that are necessary building blocks for life. So, from his perspective, life could have spontaneously begun in an early anoxic period, but now that we are in an oxic atmosphere, spontaneous life is no longer possible. In 1952, Professor Harold Urey, he was an American physical chemist and actually Nobel Prize winner for the discovery of deuterium. He worked with a graduate student, Stanley Miller. They performed an important experiment, the famous Miller-Urey experiment, that theoretically demonstrated how organic molecules could have spontaneously formed from inorganic precursors under early Earth conditions. They used a highly reduced mixture of gases. They used methane, ammonia, and hydrogen, and they are able to form basic organic monomers and some amino acids by cycling them through an apparatus that delivered electrical sparks to the mixture. These kinds of experiments were furthered by Sidney Fox, a Los Angeles biochemist, and his explorations demonstrated what he believed was the synthesis of amino acids from inorganic molecules and even the progenitors of peptides. According to his view, the spontaneous generation of life was possible with appropriate thermal energy inputs. So, how might life have begun then? There are some things that must be accounted for in any narrative. So, for example, chirality, which is the handedness of molecules, is one, and we'll discuss that. And some form of catalyzation has to be present because that's basic to all biologic systems. And of course, you need organic molecules. Of all of these, organic molecules are arguably the most crucial element. How might they have arisen? Well, there are two possible sources. The first is obviously a terrestrial origin. Organic synthesis could have been driven by impacts or energy sources, for example, ultraviolet light or electrical discharges as lightning. The other option would be an extraterrestrial origin, with a theory that organic molecules form in interstellar dust clouds. However, it's clear that two properties are needed when considering organic molecules as they become life, and those two properties are self organization and self replication. These are considered the hallmarks of living systems. And there are many circumstances in which abiotic molecules exhibit such characteristics under proper conditions. For example, there's been recent research at the University of Denmark that has demonstrated these properties that to be inherent in basic polymers. Besides simple polymers, it's been found that there is spontaneous self assembly of RNA molecules. Viruses within cells will demonstrate viral self assembly. Despite this capacity and the organic molecules that may be derived from it, the abiotically generated monomers created under the conditions of the soup theory don't give any clear path. For example, in the Miller Urey experiments, although basic organic monomers were formed, compounds that would inhibit the formation of polymers were also formed in very high concentration. So when all the discussion is considered, the primordial soup theory, it's theoretically alluring, but it's filled with unanswered problems and it's not at all straightforward. So the equation is not simple. Another essential for life is autocatalysis. Autocatalytic substances are those that will catalyze the production of themselves. In essence, they're simple replicators. In 1993, Stuart Kauffman proposed that life arose as autocatalytic chemical networks. And some biologists, like Richard Dawkins, embraced this because it fit his rigidly atheistic stance. Kauffman proposed that a combination of aminoadenosine and the proper ester and an autocatalytic triacid ester and some of its variants could exhibit a competition and therefore serve as a model of a prototypical form of natural selection. So, in theory, if the proper molecules were found that were autocatalytic, they could then be linked to systems that are self organizing and self replicating. And then life and all of evolution is just a chemical process proceeding towards inevitable paths. A great deal of literature on the origin of life is centered within the search for exactly these processes. Chirality refers to the non superimposable 3D forms, just like you can see in this picture. They're mirror images of one another. That is, they demonstrate right or left handedness. It's a curious reality that biologic systems demonstrate homochirality with few exceptions. For example, amino acids are left handed, and nucleotides and sugars are right handed. In typical chemical reactions, there's generally a 50-50 split. So, chirality or homochirality is an unexpected feature of biology. Once established, at least in theory, homochirality could be selected for. And it's interesting that extraterrestrial molecules do demonstrate chirality based on meteor samples. For example, amino acids are twice as frequent in the L than the D form, possibly hinting to an extraterrestrial origin of life. A critical issue in the origin of life is the need for a cell. It's the environment of the cell that permits organization. So a protocell, as a self-organizing and ordered space bounded by a lipid membrane, is necessary for evolution. Therefore, a critical question is, how might simple protocells have arisen in the first place? At this point, no true protocell has ever been achieved in the laboratory. However, what is critical to understand is that without a boundary, life cannot separate from non living matter. It's the boundary that permits life, which, in order to occur, needs to be in contradiction to the second law of thermodynamics. I know you don't want physics, but there's got to be just a little bit. This law requires the universe to move in a direction of increased entropy, that is, increasing disorder. Physical laws are enacted through this principle. But life is different. It defies the second law by diminishing entropy, which critically it does within cellular boundaries. Crucially, though, it's the cellular boundary that permits reproduction and energy storage. The need for stabilizing membrane like structure is absolutely critical. So, we've talked about some elements that have been advanced as necessary for life, for example, chirality or self organization. The next question becomes, what might have been the specific animating factors or conditions to spark life? Let me just say that there are a lot of theories, and I'm going to offer a number of them to you, but it will have to be in quick succession. So let's start with theories based on physical actions on our planet or particular environment. In these theories, life is initiated and propelled prior to organic metabolism. One such theory is the electric spark theory. Electric sparks can generate amino acids and sugars from the atmosphere, which already has certain essential elements such as water, methane, ammonia, and hydrogen. And support for this was felt to be offered by the Miller-Urey experiment from 1953 that I previously mentioned. On Earth, in theory, lightning may have helped create the key building blocks of life in the early days. Over millions of years, larger and more complex molecules could have formed, although the mechanism of that action remains unclear. The community clay theory posits that the first molecules of life may have met or formed on clay. This idea has been championed by organic chemist Alexander Graham Cairns Smith, a Scottish chemist. His thinking was that clay surfaces might have served to concentrate organic compounds together at first, but also served beyond that by helping organize them into patterns that are much like our genes, like a template. In the clay theory, complex organic molecules arose gradually on pre existing non organic replication surfaces, and these were composed of silicate crystals in a solution. Clay minerals might have catalyzed the formation of RNA in that solution in a manner similar to being activation of nucleotides and forming them together in longer chains, and then theoretically, this process could kickstart biochemical evolution. So, this is essentially self organization with a push from the abiotic realm. This narrative offers a means towards organization, but has the problem that it doesn't specifically address the origin of replication. Some scientists have advanced theories that might encompass both replication and organization, and many of them have been offered. Underlying many of these is the concept that a particular set of environmental conditions might have been available on this planet if organic molecules were exposed to just the proper conditions to kickstart life. So, for example, one of these is the chilly start hypothesis. In this theory, ice might have covered the oceans 3 billion years ago, as the sun was about a third less luminous then than it is now. This thick layer of ice, possibly hundreds of feet thick, might have protected fragile organic compounds in the water below the ice from ultraviolet light or from destruction from cosmic impacts. The other advantage is that the cold might also help these molecules to survive longer, in effect, stabilizing them, allowing more time for key reactions so that molecular complexity could build. This is more or less the exact opposite of Darwin's warm little pond. As an alternative, in the 1970s, Thomas Gold proposed a theory called the deep hot biosphere model. In this theory, life developed first below the Earth's surface and not on the surface as is typically supposed. Newer findings of bacteria very far beneath the Earth's surface have surprising chemistries, and they can derive energy from deep Earth radioactive substances. And so the presence of these kinds of bacteria tends to support this sort of theory. And this theory, the nutritional source, is outgassing of methane from the Earth's mantle. Heat again plays a critical role in another process. Thermosynthesis conceptually is something like fermentation, but instead relies on chemiosmosis. An advantage is that this process, the process of chemiosmosis, uses ATP synthase enzyme, which is believed to be related to the first metabolic processes. And the ubiquitous role of thermal cycling in germination and cell division is considered a relic of this primordial thermosynthesis. Scientist Zachary Adams postulates the radioactive beach hypothesis, which is definitely my favorite name. In this theory, the tidal processes in the ocean that occurred during a time when the moon was much closer to the Earth than it is now may have permitted the concentration of grains of uranium and other radioactive elements at the high water mark of these primordial beaches. And it would be in that zone that life might have begun using those energy sources to initiate life. Another interesting theory is offered by Cairo Michaelian from the National Autonomous University of Mexico. He points out that any model for the origin of life must take into account that life is an irreversible thermodynamic process. Like all such processes, it dissipates energy, that is, it produces entropy. So the production of entropy can be properly viewed as not merely incidental to life, but perhaps its express purpose, the very reason for its existence. One popular theory is that life may have begun at submarine hydrothermal vents. These vents spew key hydrogen rich molecules, and there's abundant life around them today. In the theory, early Earth, there were rocky nooks that could have concentrated these molecules at the vent level, and working together may have provided minerals and catalysts for critical reactions. Now, this latter is a bridge theory towards a differing way of looking at the origin of life. The theory that considers it was the metabolism first that drove organic synthesis and utilized energy derived from basic minerals. The iron sulfur world metabolism first model was first proposed in the 1980s. This theory traces the origin of life to the synthesis of organic building blocks from simple gaseous compounds, as compared to the Miller-Urey model that used external energy sources such as lightning or ultraviolet radiation. In this model, energy was instead derived from sulfides of iron and other minerals such as pyrites. The energy was then released by reduction and oxidation reactions of these metal sulfides, and that would have yielded organic molecules, including polymers. The zinc world hypothesis is an extension of the iron sulfur world hypothesis. In the zinc world theory, specific hydrothermal fluids from thermal vents rich in hydrogen sulfide reacted with cold ocean water, which then would lead to precipitation of metal sulfide particles, such as zinc sulfide. This particle and others have the unique ability to store radiation such as ultraviolet light. And it was this energy that permitted unique photosynthetic properties that could be mediated by the zinc sulfide under just the right conditions to energize the synthesis of informational and metabolic molecules that would allow the selection of photostable nucleobases. The deep sea vent hypothesis that I mentioned earlier is derivative of this zinc world hypothesis, with hydrogen rich fluids and energy emerging from below the seafloor to initiate life. In essence, though, this is really a variant of Darwin's pond theorizing, except it's now situated in the ocean. As opposed to metabolism first, there are varying concepts of how life might have arisen with a genetics or life giving molecule first perspective. These can be divided into two types: from this earth or not. The or not group is panspermia, and this advances that life did not begin on Earth at all, but was brought here from elsewhere in space. For example, rocks regularly get blasted off Mars by cosmic impacts, and a number of Martian meteorites have been found on Earth that some researchers have controversially suggested even brought microbes here. I like this idea because potentially then we're all Martians. However, even if this concept were true, the question of how life began on Earth would only change to how life began elsewhere in space, so the problem is not solved. One alternative is called the RNA world hypothesis. In our observable biologic system, DNA needs proteins in order to form, but proteins require DNA to form. This is a problem, since How could you have formed one without the other? Well, one answer could be RNA. RNA can store information like DNA, it serves as an enzyme, it can help create both DNA and proteins. So, in theory, after an RNA start, DNA and proteins could have succeeded this RNA world because they're more efficient. Of course, this simply begs the question because how did RNA get there in the first place? RNA is central to life, it's central to translation, and it's critical in the catalysis of the chemical groups and processes of life. Eugene Koonin, an evolutionary biologist, points out that despite a great deal of experimental effort, and despite all the theoretical conjecturing, there is no real evidence of how replication and translation began. Furthermore, and very critically, there is no knowledge of where RNA replicase came from, and this is absolutely necessary for translation to continue. So, the core biologic processes still remain unanswered, even if there is an RNA beginning, since the very essential catalytic enzyme origins remain a mystery. One answer is called simple beginnings. Instead of developing from complex molecules such as RNA, in theory, life might have begun with smaller molecules interacting with each other in cycles of reaction. One other possibility is that there were different nucleic acids that preceded RNA. It's called the pre RNA world scenario. This has led some scientists to believe that RNA was preceded by an entirely different genetic system prior to the appearance of RNA on Earth. New research is offering another intriguing perspective. It has been long assumed that viruses were latecomers to evolution. It was assumed that they emerged after cells, since they require the cell's machinery to reproduce. However, the discovery of giant viruses has upset this prior narrative. Nearly a decade ago, a huge virus was found. It had more than 1,000 genes. They called it virus for the mimicking microbe virus. They named it this way since amoeba appeared to mistake this giant virus for their typical bacterial meal. Bacteria are much larger than viruses. Within the last year, other very large viruses have been identified, which include genes for their own replication, and even some protein manufacturing, and even DNA repair. One such virus is known as a pithovirus. Another huge virus, pandavirus, has been identified that has over 2,500 genes. That's more than 10% of the human complement. And 90% of those genes don't resemble any other genes that are found on Earth. Eugene Koonin, that evolutionary biologist I mentioned, believes that these complex viruses are alive and that they evolved much earlier than ever imagined, and perhaps earlier than cells, and they may even have propelled cellular life. So, from his perspective, viruses emerged when life was just a floating stew of genetic material, and therefore it's a major factor in shaping life as we know it on this planet. In essence, then, we all share a deep viral past. If you're not a fan of DNA or viruses, we have an alternative for you. Many scientists hold other views. For example, the lipid world or the GARD model has been advanced now. The lipid world model holds that the first self replicating objects were lipid like. The theoretical proposal is that any lipid bilayer membrane could be composed of a large variety of heterogeneous chemical mixtures. A chance local arrangement of these compounds as membrane components could have constituted the means of initiating a hypercycle, which is a new level of organization in which self replicating units can connect to each other in an autocatalytic manner. A differing perspective is based on polyphosphates. One of the major problems with most origin of life theories is that when thermodynamic equilibrium is considered, the drive is for amino acids to remain separate. Less order is favored over higher degrees of order, so there would not be any initiating drive for the violation of the second law of thermodynamics that would permit the first set of polymerizations. One solution lies within the properties of polyphosphates. Polyphosphates cause the polymerization of amino acids in peptides and are logical precursors towards ATP formation, which provides the energy for the cell. Yet one additional alternative is based on polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. These are known to be abundant in the universe and in meteorites. These can be among the most complex molecules found so far in space. So they would be a logical candidate as a precursor to RNA to set the RNA world in motion. And of course, there always has to be a synthesis. There's always a combination of a valve. This is called the multiple genesis hypothesis. This is basically a mix and match, a variety of all the things that I've mentioned and how we've discussed so far. So we've discussed many aspects of the origin of life. But what then are the essential features of life on this planet to which all these theories must conform? It can be advanced that the primary requirements of life are enacted in the cell and are embodied in only a few key characteristics. The first requirement is cognition. There can be no doubt of the cognitive capacity of life. As James Shapiro, professor of microbiology at the University of Chicago, has stated, quote, life requires cognition at every level. What then ensues from that? Communication and problem solving. That's the mission of cells once life has been initiated. How is this problem solving communicated? This is heredity in all its forms. But obviously, a metabolic scheme needs to be present. However, that cannot progress without recognition that allows one improved scheme to separate from another. This is the function of immunology. The result is evolvability. All of these features are necessary to get us to life as we know it on this planet. So you might be asking, when did life actually originate on Earth? The earliest life on Earth existed before 3.5 billion years ago. Physical evidence for life on Earth is found in biogenic graphite within 3.7 billion year old sedimentary rocks which have been discovered in Greenland. It can also be seen in microbial mat fossils found in 3.5 billion year old sandstone discovered in Australia. Some scientists actually believe that life originated earlier at the level of hydrothermal vents over 4 billion years ago. The origin of life outside of this planet is a subject of particularly rich debate. It doesn't really help since it offers no specific answer to the origin of life question, but it's still important. Exogenesis is similar but not identical to panspermia, where the origin of life is removed from our planet and it still remains mysterious. Exogenesis suggests that life may have arisen in a single location, in a single galaxy, and spread. If so, the spread of life could be modeled after the most ubiquitous biologic process on this planet, infectious interchange. It seems that organic compounds can have an extraterrestrial origin. They're common in space. They've been formed in what has been termed factories of complex molecular synthesis, whose formation is believed to be enhanced by ionizing radiation. These compounds can be found in the Murchison meteor. This is a large meteor strike in Australia, a well known one. And this meteor, as well as others, are rich in organic compounds, including common amino acids. Lastly, in March 2015, NASA scientists reported that they were successful in forming complex DNA and RNA organic compounds, including uracil, cytosine, and thymine in the lab, using conditions known to exist in outer space. That synthesis was accomplished by starting with chemicals like pyrimidine, found in meteorites also, and known to exist in outer space. So life might be anywhere in the universe. If intelligent life exists outside of Earth, where is it? This is a grand and encompassing question. One very important perspective was offered by the great physicist Enrico Fermi while he was working at Los Alamos National Lab in the 1950s. He was at a casual lunchtime conversation with colleagues, and the topic of extraterrestrial life came up. It was based on a cartoon by Alan Dunn in the New Yorker. The problem was that a number of trash cans were disappearing in New York City, and Alan Dunn was mockingly indicating that it was the work of aliens. At one point in the conversation, Fermi reacts to the notion that life in the universe is abundant and just not close. In turn, he posed a very simple but a very arresting question. Okay, where are they? The Fermi paradox is basically this. If life is supposed to be abundant in the universe, where is it and why don't we know it's there? The quest for this answer led derivatively to the Drake equation. This latter equation is used as a rough mathematical means of considering the probability of extraterrestrial life. And the factors that are considered to be included are calculations and estimations of the probability of Earth like planets, the probability of human like intelligence given life, the likely incidence of high technology among those life forms, the chance of civilization, And Fermi himself actually made the first calculations kind of on the back of an envelope sort of way for the preliminary Drake equation in 1950. His conclusions reinforced the notion of a paradox. Based on generally accepted probabilities for all of those input parameters, the probabilities of extraterrestrial life would seem to be great, but there's simply no evidence of it. It's interesting that the perplexing nature of this problem is actually contained in the alternative name for the Fermi paradox, the Great Silence. So then what might account for the Fermi paradox? Well, many theories have been offered. We have time only to quickly mention a few. For example, life could be abundant, but there are no or few civilizations with which we might communicate. The Earth might just be a rare entity or even a unique one. It's possible that intelligent life destroys itself. It's possible that intelligent life exists, but it gets destroyed by galactic phenomena. Life could be abundant, but the distances between that life is so great that communication cannot be accommodated. An interesting alternative is the inflation hypothesis. Cosmologist Alan Guth proposed a multiverse solution. In his theory, universes are always being formed, and young universes vastly outnumber the old ones. And cognition, which is a derivative phenomena, is young and immature in the greatest majority of those universes, these young universes, based on probability distribution measures. Here's one I like, the zoo hypothesis. This states that super intelligent extraterrestrial life exists, but does not contact life on Earth to give us space for natural evolution and development. Basically, we're being observed from afar in our natural habitat by extraterrestrial intelligence. We've talked about the origin of life on Earth and then discussed the possibility of life elsewhere. However, a valid question should be raised. How do we define life? And what are its boundaries? This is not such an easy question to answer, and that answer has actually changed over time. In general, we define life as a set of characteristics that distinguishes physical entities that have biological processes from those that don't. Basically, these processes separate the living from the inanimate, but the criteria can be ambiguous. For example, it has been long considered that viruses, prions, and some other subviral particles are not alive. Yet newer research shows that these entities have some degree of sentience and can participate in their own reproduction. It would seem that genetic aggregates that are not cellular would therefore qualify as life forms currently if life were to be considered as based on any level of cognitive awareness. Therefore, life is invested in every microbial entity, contrary to our prior beliefs. There is then an implication that life might be considered a property rather than discrete processes, and further, that this property of life seems to exist on a sliding scale from its lowest scope and then beyond. To illustrate this, there are complex molecules that exhibit memory and a form of very primitive intelligence. One such molecule is the vital protein mTOR, that's the mammalian target of rapamycin. This molecule is derived from the discovery of the antibiotic rapamycin in a microbe discovered on Easter Island, which is also known as Rapa Nui. Rapamycin was found to block a protein, mTOR, which stops a fungal cell division cycle. However, it has an extremely wide range of very important effects in humans too. In its human form, mTOR can accomplish some startling things. It participates in nutrients, energy, and oxidation pathways, and the manufacture of proteins through messenger RNA and ribosomes. It's necessary for the proper function of the cytoskeleton of the cell. The question arises, how might one molecule control such a vast array of processes, assess nutrients, oxygen levels, energy consumption, and even remodel the developing human brain? It behaves like a brain itself, at least in the manner in which it integrates all these processes and seems to make a wide range of simultaneous decisions. So, is mTOR independently alive? Does it have mind? I believe that the best answer for us today is to consider that life is defined as being invested in any cognitive entity. Therefore, bacteria that can demonstrate decision making from multiple inputs, group behavior, and advanced communication are distinctly alive. In the same context, then, we might consider life to be a property that is invested even within our individual cells, which are also cognitive entities. And they use elaborate forms of communication and they participate in engineering genetic material. Life then becomes a property that is beyond being And the action of this property, importantly, is communication, problem solving, and collaboration. Of course, this is not the only way to think about life. There are other perspectives. For example, here's this statement, quote, life is an engine propelled by evolution. This is the statement of Martin Nowak. He's professor of mathematics and biology. He's a member of Harvard's Origins of Life Initiative. After all his studies, Nowak concludes this, and to quote, cooperation is a fundamental aspect of evolution. Further, he asserts that cooperation is the critical component at every scope and scale. For him, this is enacted at the molecular level. To Nowak, the early Earth's pre-life was not a primordial soup of chemicals, but an active generative phenomena in which mutation and selection were already acting on molecules. Only when some of them began reproducing, outcompeting the others, did life begin. I think this is a fruitful path, but misses several essential elements. To appreciate those, let's go one step further. As with Nowak, the essential collaborative nature of evolution is acknowledged. However, evolution itself is not the driver. The drivers are different. First, life includes an impulse to solve problems through physics. At a first iteration, the cell is a mechanism for entraining physics. The mechanisms and means are complex and beyond our scope today, but it's clear that the cellular environment permits a violation of the second law of thermodynamics. Order is imposed within the cellular environment by whatever means. And this means is a means towards stored energy, and importantly, stored energy opens the possibility to the amplification of biologic processes. John Torday of UCLA has shown that physiological development has been based upon a crucial reciprocative balance between lipids and calcium. He believes that this reciprocal process may have instantiated life at the outset. Beyond that, it certainly did provide the critical pathways for physiological development through a reciprocal attempt to maintain cellular homeostasis under conditions of shifting environmental stress. Well, what does this mean? It means that the essential essence is awareness. Cognition is imbued in every cell and even within the non-cellular microbial realm, even prions, which are only misfolded proteins. They have awareness, and they can cooperate and communicate. At the cellular level, it's an inescapable reality. Life requires cognition at every level. If this cognitive capacity is granted as a given for life, then by what mechanism is the narrative distilled? Arnold de Loef, a professor of physiology and cellular biology from Belgium, makes the case that the essential elements of life are communication and problem solving. There's a great deal on this. These qualities, above all else, define life from non life. Therefore, the case can be productively made that communication and the capacity to reciprocally solve problems, which is best seen at the cellular level, is surely what counts above all other definitions of life. We can gain support for this point of view when we examine the consequences of the property of life on this planet. Surprisingly, towards that understanding, what we should properly consider as the current end product of evolution has been the subject of a recent change of opinion. In another era, we perceived any macroorganism as a single whole. Selection operated on the entire macroorganism. Now we know differently. Macroorganisms may appear to be a unity, but they are instead comprised of a minority of innate cells, which are consonant with the species, and they're linked in a partnership to a greater majority of microbial partners. This is now referred to as the hologenome concept. This is an entirely new means of appraising complex organisms. The hologenome concept asserts that complex organisms should be properly viewed as a vast partnership of co-linked, collaborative, and competitive cellular ecology that function together so intimately that they feel like a seamless whole. So all complex creatures on this planet, all eukaryotes, they're all hologenomes, and there are no exceptions. Importantly, hologenomes are the embodiment of the cellular communication and problem solving through cooperation, collaboration, and competition. That is the great drama of life on our planet. We are then a reiteration of basic properties empowered by the cellular environment. With all this, then, what might we say about the origin of life and what life means for the planet and evolution? How did life begin? We don't know. But we've made progress in our understanding. As yet, there are no direct answers. However, our path towards understanding the origin of life does give us insight as to what life means on this planet. We have learned that the basic cell is a complex enactment of physical properties in a new reproductive whole. What underlies the cell then is an entrainment of physics, utilizing basic minerals and organic molecules. These building blocks may be common in nature, but to join them into living systems requires lipid membranes and sugars and genes and calcium, all meeting in an environment in which reciprocating combinations can enact. How exactly that happens and in precisely what order is not yet known. We've learned that life is cognition and that it exists at every scope and scale. We've learned that cognition is itself a property of being able to recognize the state, which is best considered as self referential, to be able to distinguish self from non self. If life is cognition, then we have also learned that cognition is communication, and further, that the purpose of cognition and communication is problem solving. Therefore, life occurs when the ability to communicate as a means towards problem solving occurs. On this planet, communication and problem solving is embedded and amplified and self reinforced within the compartment of the cell. We do not know how the interface between life and non life was crossed, but we can assert that the difference, the point of division, rests discretely between chemical processes on one hand and communication and problem solving capacity on the other. There may never have been just one line that was ever crossed. It may have been a sliding scale to life as we know it now. And paradoxically, that life appears to require boundaries for its enactment. But once cognition, communication, and problem solving become entwined within the cellular compartment, then the rest of life can be considered as a fractal, reiterative process to meet environmental stresses. The cell responds to such stresses with collaboration and co-linkage, cooperation, and competition. This is a process of cellular and genetic engineering, which is both random and not. The end result is just what we have: hologenomes, as vast collaborations of linked cellular ecologies, able to meet the external environment through communication, cognition, and problem solving. This is life on our planet, and this is the source of evolutionary change.